And we'll move on to the next talk, which is from Jeremy Gibbons. So Jeremy is a professor of computing at the University of Oxford, where he leads the Algebra of Programming Research group. And Jeremy's talk is about model-driven metadata-based software engineering. And Jeremy, over to you.
Great, thank you, Dimitris. That was a very confident, compelling talk by Samana. Well done. I'm going to talk about very briefly, about a series of projects that we've been doing in Oxford on what we call semantic frameworks. So this is basically about data-rich information sharing domains and between various different classes of people, heterogeneous collaborations. And it started off with work in clinical trials. So these will be the scientists designing a trial and the nurses running a trial, and then the people having to approve a trial for ethics and so on, reporting obligations. So different classes of people involved in a process. These trials are often low budget. I mean, they're high budget when it gets well through the development of a drug, but when you're just testing out hypotheses, they have to be done on a very agile, low cost basis because it's just a very small trials unit. And this is a domain in which transparency is very important because people want to know whether you're asking the right questions and properly reporting the results. So this is all very good domain for model-driven development, where we're generating software systems rather than constructing them manually, and we've got models to explain what the systems do. And the metadata comes in because of documenting the rich domain and sharing perspectives across the different participants. So this is, I say, something we started with clinical trials, but it turns out to have lots of much wider applicability than that. We also did some experiments, some work with electronic governance, and basically, if you rename patients to citizens, and the same technology works for building e-governance websites and stuff like that. So this is we're trying to be as simple as possible, as lightweight as possible. And I should offer the disclaimer that I'm talking about historical aspects of this project because I've been out of the loop of it for about a decade, but the work has continued in my absence. So it's still live. It's just that my involvement is not. So a starting point for the story is work that oncologists were doing with drugs for breast cancer, and lots of individual trials didn't show any significant effects of these drugs. But it turns out that if you put all the trials together, the results of all the trials together, then you do get significant results. So the individual trials were too small to show an effect, but once you combine all the trials, then you do get an effect, and this has saved thousands of lives. But to put the results of the trials together, you need to know whether they were compatible in the first place. So you need not just the numbers you collected from the individual trials, you need a record of the questions that were asked and the ways the data was collected, the semantic metadata behind the trial. And the only way that's going to be properly described and collected and curated and preserved and associated with all the data and maintained as it moves from filing cabinet to filing cabinet is if you have good tools for doing that. If it has to be done manually, it's just not going to get done by busy medics. So there's a compelling connection here between the need for semantic annotation, metadata, and tools to support these generated tools, model-driven tools to support data collection and annotation. So basically, we were trying to do two things. We were trying to improve, or I mean, not us, but trying to help the oncologists to improve the science by this meta-analysis, which is the state of the art in clinical research. Individual trials tend to be too small, but Lots of people are doing them, and you can put them together. But we want to do this without imposing lots of drudgery on the trials units, because they're not professional software developers. They don't really want to do this. They have to. But what they want to do is so similar that we should be able to generate it from an abstract description. So basically, there's a software product line of software tools for clinical trials, just varying in small details. And we should be able to generate custom software for these for this purpose without having to build anything by hand. You should be able to just build a model of the trial and press a button and generate the software for it. And the semantics we mean here is nothing fancy. It's not formal mathematical denotational semantics. It's just recording what people intended, what they meant, what they did, and not even trying to do any clever inference 5 or 10 years later to see whether two data sets are compatible. That's a hard AI problem. But if you just record what people were intending and what they did and keep that safe, then a medical expert can come along 5 or 10 years later and look at this and say, yeah, that way of measuring blood pressure is compatible with this other way of measuring blood pressure. So let's put those two sets of blood pressures together. So the kind of thing you need to know when you collect data is you have a question, you have an answer to that question, but you also, when answering the question, you kind of need to know what the purpose of the question is, not just the question itself. You need to know why the question is being asked in order to give a proper answer to the question. And I've got lots of examples of this. I've bumped into somebody at a party and asked, where are you from? Perhaps a bit clumsily, and their answer depends on what they were thinking of me. Did they come from home, or are they Chinese, or do I mean whereabouts in the UK they're currently living? That can mean all sorts of things. My colleague Jim Davies, who was the leader of this project, has a nice story about answering the question, are you vegetarian? He's vegetarian, but when he's asked by the airline with which he's a frequent flyer, are you vegetarian? He says no. The answer to that question is no, because the purpose is not to know whether he's vegetarian, but to know whether they want a special meal assigned to the seat he's in. And he has a theory that if he says he's vegetarian, he's less likely to get upgraded to business class if they don't have the right meal for him. And he'd rather go hungry and be in business class. So the answer to the question depends very much on the purpose in asking the question. Different people have different means, different purposes, different intentions, different things they want to record. What we can't try to do, what we don't want to try to do, is agree one standard that everyone should conform to and do things in one unified way. That's far too idealistic. There's no way we can impose that. Instead, the best we can do is allow different communities to just describe what they're doing, their local conventions, and record those and make those available later. And for that to work, we need lightweight tools that will support the communities in doing this. So lightweight tools for the communities to build a description of the kind of things they do, and then use that description in describing an experiment they're doing, a trial they're running. And then so they say how they collect blood pressure, and maybe they have 3 different ways of doing it: lying down, standing up, after use on a treadmill, whether you're in a stressful situation, and so on. And they just describe that, write it down somewhere, and use that information in setting up this trial. So this trial, we're going to measure your blood pressure after you've been lying down for 5 minutes. So let's just drag and drop that description of measuring blood pressure, and we'll annotate that, preserve it in the data set. And then 5 or 10 years later, when all these people have moved on and nobody remembers what happened, somebody looking to integrate this data set with other data sets can look at the description of what was done and why it was done, and maybe get some useful data integration out of that. So we did this in a project called CancelGrid initially, which was funded by the MRC, the Medical Research Council, a long time ago now. And it was at the time that grid computing was a big thing. And so it's got grid in the name, although it doesn't actually have anything to do with the grid. And it was with oncologists in the first place, but it's not in any way specific to cancer, and certainly lots of the other uses of it since have been in other for other diseases, other medical issues. So the name is a bit of a misnomer, but that's the name we had at the time. And we distilled everything down to a kind of two-phase process. The two phases are designing a trial and running a trial. So you're a medic, you want to conduct some medical experiment. So you decide, well, let's try these two treatments with a drug and see which one works better. So we design a trial to do that. Describe the trial, get regulatory approval, get funding for it, and assuming those all pass, then we can run the trial. We collect a whole bunch of people and we take blood pressures and give them drugs and see what happens. But designing a trial is quite a formulaic process because trials are all very similar. So the designing a trial can be done in basically a drag and drop style. And running a trial is also a very formulaic process because you just talk to patients and collect data and fill in forms. And it turns out it's the same formulaic process. So there's this two-level mechanism of describing the trial you want and then running the trial, two phases, design time and run time, if you like. And the way we instantiated this, where we made this work, is by having a meta model of what it is to be a trial, and the trial designer instantiates that meta model to have a model of their trial at the top right of the diagram. And they do that by filling in some kind of form, some kind of smart form, a trial designer form that instantiates the meta model and gives you a trial model. And then from that, you can transform it, if it's in a structured format, like an XML format, you can transform that into a bunch of case report forms, so schemas for case report forms, which again can be instantiated in a standard data entry mechanism. Microsoft InfoPath is what we used. So given a model of a form, you load it into InfoPath, and that gives you a data entry mechanism whereby you type in patient's name and age and blood pressure and all this stuff. So it's the process that a clinician goes through, the process that a researcher goes through in designing a trial is completely parallel to the process that a clinician goes through in running a trial. So I had this, I wrote a paper about this at the time, form follows function, so taking this slogan from architecture as form ever follows function, this is the law. But the point here is that in a sufficiently constrained domain, like clinical trials, the functionality that we want is so regular that you don't need to write software from scratch to implement it. You can just drag and drop components from a form. So very amenable to model-driven development. So unpacking the diagram from 2 slides ago, we didn't need to write any software, any custom software. Off-the-shelf stuff works, and we used InfoPath and SharePoint for this. Works particularly well in the UK National Health Service because they are all Microsoft institutions anyway, so they all have this software anyway. They didn't need to buy anything. The data models are document schemas. The entities that are instances of the models are documents that conform to those schemas. Authoring a document, so instantiating an entity is a matter of completing a form, one of those conformant documents. And the model transformations that we need are nothing more sophisticated than schema mappings. So you might see this as somewhat dual to executable UML. I don't know if that's still a thing, but it was at the time, which is trying to make the data models executable, we were kind of going in the opposite direction. We were trying to take the execution that you want to happen and say, well, this is just characterized by a data model. And so this is Fred Brooks's slogan about I don't want to see the code. I just want to see the data models, and that's sufficient. Everything else is determined by that. So just to show some examples, the text will be too small to read here, but this is a meta model of forms as it happens. There are form controls, and there are choices, and forms have tables and sections and fields and things like that. This is used to at the researcher level to design some of the entities that you might need in a trial. So this is a trial with three study groups. So there's a 2+1 study group and a 3+0 study group, which are two different treatments, and there's a control study group. And these codes and meanings can just be sort of dragged and dropped, built by drag and drop in InfoPath or Enterprise Architect, things like that. And then this gives you a model of the trial, which of course is represented in some structured format, for example, XML. And from that model of the trial, you can generate a model of the kinds of artifacts you need to run the trial. So here is a model of the data you want to collect about the study group that a participant is in. It's an enumeration. They're either in the 2+1 study group or the 3+0 study group or the control study group. And this data description is enough to generate a form for the nurse to use to say, well, which study group is this patient going to be put in, 2+1 or 3+0 or control? We found that was very successful, and it's pretty simple. We had all sorts of fancy model-driven technology that we tried using, and we discovered that we didn't need it. And this commercial off-the-shelf software in this very limited domain where forms are sufficient worked very well for us. I think that, let me put these 2 points in the opposite order. We've had lots of other funding and ongoing funding from Microsoft, from research councils, from the Bill Gates Foundation, EPSRC, MRC, European Union, National Institute for Health Research, I think that is, the National Health Service, and work is very much going on at the moment. My experience is over a decade old with this, but I think explainability is even more important now than it was then, because even more decisions are being made now automatically by machine learning or classifiers and not by people, and explaining what happened then so that you can reuse the data 5 or 10 years later is even more important. So maintaining those metadata descriptions and preserving them with the data is even more important now. The latest version of the Metadata Registry that we built is open source. It's now called Mauro, and there's a GitHub link there. And my thanks go to all the collaborators on this project, particularly Jim Davies, who was the PI, but other names there as well. And I'll stop there.